So, welcome everyone and belated Happy Darwin Day. Today marks 4 years since our first recorded lecture, and we have had regular lectures since then on a wide range of topics relating to evolution and psychiatry. These can be viewed on our playlist of the YouTube channel of the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland. We have the honour today of welcoming back Dr. Riadh Abed for this year's Darwin Day lecture. Riadh is founding chair and current chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group, the first such organisation in the world. Riadh is also chair of the World Psychiatric Association section of evolutionary psychiatry, and he has authored countless articles on all aspects of evolutionary psychiatry. And he has special interests in the areas of eating disorders, psychosis, and mismatch generally. In more recent times, he is developing his fascinating EvoBioPsychoSocial Model, which he will be presenting to us today. Riadh is also co-editor with Paul St. John Smith of Evolutionary Psychiatry, which I'll show to you here. And this is the go-to text for anyone interested in the field, from beginners through to experts. Chapter 2 of that book relates to the EvoBioPsychoSocial Model, which Riadh will be talking to us about today. Most importantly, Riadh has been a great friend to me and to our special interest group here in Ireland, always there with advice and willingness to help and collaborate with any projects. Although retired now as a consultant psychiatrist with the NHS, I think Riadh is busier than ever, writing, engaging in research and lecturing on all aspects of evolutionary psychiatry. So Riadh, Fáilte Arás Go Héireann, welcome back to Ireland, albeit virtually, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Henry. Thanks for inviting me for a second time. I think my first appearance at your webinar series was in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And also, it's a great pleasure to collaborate with fellow evolutionists from Ireland and to see how the Irish EPSIG has been growing and flourishing in its influence and activities, thanks to your energy, enthusiasm, and that of your colleagues. So the interest in looking at closely at the biopsychosocial model was triggered by the publication of this book by Bolton and Gillett, which was the first in-depth scientific and philosophical review of the biopsychosocial model for some time, and it aimed at revitalizing and updating the model. What caught my attention and that of my colleagues at the time was the near total absence of any consideration of the evolutionary perspective. Of course, we know as evolutionists that this is nothing new. The absence of evolution pervades the whole of mainstream psychiatry and most mainstream psychiatric texts, and it is the mission or part of the mission of both the UK and the Irish EPSIGs to try and reverse this state of affairs. So the EvoBioPsychoSocial Model, as we dubbed it, is a collaborative project between Adam Hunt, Paul St. John Smith, and myself, and has resulted in the publication of 3 articles, a chapter, as you mentioned, in the edited volume, an article in the journal. I can't remember the journal's name now. Okay. So yes, in the journal Evolution, Medicine and Public Health, and more recently an editorial in the BJ Psych. So our starting point, our starting position regarding the biopsychosocial model is that we consider it to be an advance over the standard biomedical model, but that it remains incomplete and in need of review and updating. Specifically, we consider the absence of any evolutionary science from any review of the model to be a serious omission, as evolution has the status of an inescapable law of nature that applies to all life sciences, including medicine and psychiatry. So in my presentation, I hope to demonstrate the added value that the evolutionary perspective brings to the standard biopsychosocial model and to the understanding of mental disorder generally. And I will also argue that this can have a clear positive clinical benefit, which should be demonstrable through future research and clinical experience. So we'll start with a little bit of history. The biopsychosocial model originates from primarily from the work of George Engel, who's an American physician and psychiatrist, who published two papers in 1977 and 1980. And those two papers are the sum total contribution that he made to specifying and fleshing out the model. And these two papers remain to this day the cornerstone of what we refer to as the biopsychosocial model. Now, George Engel was critical of the dominant biomedical model, mainly because of his concerns that it was too reductionistic. Now, I'm going to compare and contrast the biomedical model with the biopsychosocial model and the EvoBioPsychoSocial Model. And just to dispel any confusion, I will start by saying a few words about what the biomedical model is, because I find that sometimes colleagues use these terms interchangeably when they're actually quite different concepts and different models. So biomedicine appears for the first time in Britain in 1923 in Dorland's Medical Dictionary, which defines biomedicine as the practice of medicine guided by physiology and biochemistry. So biomedicine has its roots in 19th century scientific medicine, the prototype of which is the germ theory of disease. I suggest that it is reasonable to think of biomedicine as the original broken machine model of disease. That's to say that it looks at disease as a condition where, or a situation where there is something broken within our bodies or brains. It may also be considered to be the original medical model, and it is still influential in medical thinking and research today. Biomedicine, of course, had spectacular successes in discovering the causes and later on specific treatments for a wide range of infectious and other acute medical conditions. It led to specific diagnostic tests, vaccines, and antibiotics, which have saved millions of lives. However, its successes in chronic, debilitating medical conditions have been somewhat less impressive. Now, it is of interest that biomedicine came rather late to psychiatry compared to the rest of medicine. This may have been due to the dominance of Freudian psychoanalysis in the first half of the 20th century, especially in the United States. However, biomedicine was not fully integrated into mainstream psychiatry until the publication of the DSM-3 in 1980. And I can remember that very, very clearly in my own training. The publication of the DSM-3 was a radical shift in diagnostic practices and also in the concept of mental disorders, with their clear and crisp diagnostic criteria and also strict diagnostic entities, compared to what prevailed before, which was rather vague and woolly and dependent on individual opinion. Nevertheless, by 1980, when the DSM-3 was published, there were in fact very few breakthroughs to be made, as conditions such as neurosyphilis, which were common in mental asylums throughout the world, had already been diagnosed and treated. And of course, we know that treatment of neurosyphilis is quite straightforward. Once you diagnose it, you treat it with penicillin and they tend to respond, although you can't cure the brain damage, but you can certainly stop the disease. And no new cases of neurosyphilis were being admitted. However, the original hope that there was going to be a flurry of conditions similar to neurosyphilis, with a simple a single etiology that can be diagnosed, tested, and treated, never materialized. And now no one expects such silver bullet discoveries to be made regarding mental disorder. We now have realized that all common mental disorders have very complex etiologies that are not amenable to a simple diagnostic test or a single etiological factor. Now, in mainstream psychiatry, the biomedical model continues to thrive in the form of contemporary biological psychiatry, which is the dominant school of thought in psychiatry today. So Engel was influenced by the general systems theory of Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who was an Austrian-born Canadian philosopher and theoretical biologist. The general systems theory is a kind of emergence theory that views living organisms in a form of a hierarchy of various levels, starting from the subatomic to the atomic to the molecular to the organelles, cells, tissues, right up to the biosphere. And each level is, according to von Bertalanffy, is a dynamic whole. And with each new level, new novel emergent properties arise which did not exist in at lower levels of organization. So, excuse me. So Bertalanffy believed that holistic models are a better way of understanding living systems than mechanistic reductionistic models, and this resonates with quite a significant range of evolutionary views, where evolutionists focus their interest on phenotypic end products of selection, because it is the phenotype that acts in the world and leads to and has effects on survival and reproduction. And these phenotypic end products cannot be reduced to lower levels of organization without loss of without significant loss of information. Nevertheless, Engel largely avoided philosophical arguments beyond opposition to reductionism and to biomedical dogmatism. His main purpose was to underline that a proper understanding of ill health requires an understanding of the person's psychological and social state. So some simple examples of the benefits of the biopsychosocial model over the standard biomedical model. We just take the example of depression. The biopsychosocial model observes that even a perfect understanding of the neurobiological changes associated with a mental with a disorder such as depression could still miss basic and important information about the causes of such changes without knowledge of the social context, for instance, bereavement, loss of job, bankruptcy, and so forth. In other words, that interpersonal events or events occurring at the interpersonal level, such as bereavement, job loss, and bankruptcy, cannot be reduced to the molecular level without significant loss of information. They must be understood at the appropriate level, which is the interpersonal. A second example is the placebo response, which is, of course, widely recognized as real and significant in clinical practice. And this also cannot be understood within a purely biomedical framework, as it occurs at the interpersonal level. So all in all, many consider the biopsychosocial model to be largely uncontroversial and an advance over the reductionistic biomedical model. This is a simple diagrammatic representation of the biopsychosocial model proposed by, interestingly, by one of its critics, Roberts, in a paper published 2023, where somatic factors interact with psychological factors and social factors, producing disease and disorder. Now, the biopsychosocial model has been subject to criticisms from its very inception, and the criticisms have emanated both from philosophers and from clinicians. These are some illustrative examples of the kind of criticisms leveled at the biopsychosocial model. It's been described as being devoid of scientific content, simply being a mirage. Nasir Gaimi, who is a clinician and a psychiatrist, has suggested that the biopsychosocial model can devolve to arbitrary decisions by clinicians in focusing on the bio, the psycho, or the social, however they see fit, a state he described somewhat pejoratively as unprincipled eclecticism. Also, Robert saying the same thing using different words, he described it as wayward biopsychosocial model discourse. So it's been described as being vague and clinically impractical. And all of these criticisms and problems may have led to the continued dominance of the biomedical model in medical and psychiatric research, while at the same time paying lip service to the biopsychosocial model. However, even the critics, interestingly, of the biopsychosocial model agree that the biomedical model is in fact unsatisfactory, as it leads to excessive reductionism. And McLaren, who is a vocal critic of the biopsychosocial, described the biomedical model as demeaning and dehumanizing. Now, McLaren, who is, as I mentioned, one of the critics of the biopsychosocial model, surveyed the references to the biopsychosocial model in the literature over the 4 to 5 decades of its existence, and noted that in fact, the references to the biopsychosocial model have increased year on year, so that there were 0 before 1977, the date of Engel's first paper, whereas in 2019 there were 319 references to the biopsychosocial model. And this is likely to be an underestimate, because the biopsychosocial model is frequently referred to under different names. In fact, despite all the criticisms, it is still referred to very frequently in the literature. So Adam, Paul, and I, in thinking about how we can integrate or incorporate evolutionary thinking into the biopsychosocial model, took as our starting point Tinbergen's 4 causal domains, otherwise known as Tinbergen's 4 questions. Now, this table will be familiar to evolutionists, but it may not be so familiar to our mainstream psychiatric colleagues. Now, Nicholas Tinbergen is the co-founder of the science of ethology and a Nobel laureate. He proposed that a full understanding of any biological phenomena, whether functional or dysfunctional, requires an understanding of all 4 domains of its causation, which are mechanism, development, phylogeny, and function. The intellectual roots of this system go back to Ernest Mayr, who was the foremost evolutionary biologist of the 20th century, who proposed the proximate ultimate causal split. And what Tinbergen did was to split these 2 domains into 2 further domains. So we end up with this 2x2 table, which was proposed by Randolph Nesse in his 2013 paper, where the top row consists of mechanism and ontogeny or development, and these are collectively known as proximate causes. They are the answer to the how questions, and they will be familiar to mainstream psychiatry and medicine. The bottom row, phylogeny and function, are the answers to the why questions, and they are known as ultimate or evolutionary causation, and these are the added value that evolutionary thinking brings to the understanding of disease and disorder in psychiatry and medicine. It's important to note that all 4 causal domains or questions apply to the understanding of all biological phenomena. They are not mutually exclusive. So what we proposed in our review of the biopsychosocial model was that we would subject each of Engel's 3 levels, the bio, the psycho, and the social, to Tinbergen's 4 questions. So we have 4 questions, 3 levels. We end up with a 12-cell table, and I'll show you that in a moment, but I'm going to digress just for a few seconds, just for the sake of clarity, to say something about what evolutionary psychiatry's focus is on. Now, evolutionary psychiatry focuses on the importance of function. Now, function is central in biology because function is what is shaped by selection in the service of survival and reproduction. Evolutionists and evolutionary psychiatrists consider the understanding of function to be an important stepping stone to the understanding of dysfunction. Now, it's interesting that mainstream psychiatry has gone straight into understanding, exploring and understanding dysfunction without a coherent or a clear approach to, or even recognition to understanding function, so you will notice that in standard psychiatric text, function is hardly ever mentioned, with the exception of anxiety disorders. Granted that the function of many neurobiological systems remains poorly understood, nevertheless, the importance of function should be noted, and this is something that evolutionists care about. Another thing I want to mention is that one of the early benefits of applying evolution, or the evolutionary perspective, to the biopsychosocial is the insight and recognition that, in fact, all three levels of Engel's bio, psycho, and social are in fact biological, and they have been influenced, even shaped, by selection in different ways and to different degrees. So the bio refers to the somatic, the psycho refers to the subjective, and the social refers to the interpersonal. So this is the 12-cell table that that I mentioned to you, where we subject each of Engel's three levels to Tinbergen's 4 questions. Now, I have color-coded these cells so that you can easily delineate the 3 models. The biomedical model are the red cells. So the biomedical model focuses exclusively on mechanism and development of the somatic. The Engel's biopsychosocial model extends its remit to the psychological and social levels, but remains within the proximate domain. It is only the EvoBioPsychoSocial Model, which is applying evolutionary thinking, that then reveals the other 6 boxes, which are in black. So I would suggest to you this is maybe a simplistic way of demonstrating how reductionism works within these 3 models, and also how the evolutionary approach overcomes this reductionism by extending its remit to a whole range of other areas, and is able to ask novel questions. So just for illustrative purposes, I'll just go through the 4 questions as they apply to the psychological level, to Engel's psychological level. So one can ask regarding mechanism, what are the psychological mechanisms involved in a given phenomena? What are the developmental processes for that psychological mechanisms? What are, in terms of phylogeny, what are the phylogenetic roots of the psychological mechanism? And what function did the psychological mechanism serve in the ancestral environment? Applying the same questions to depression, again, you will notice the same color scheme, where the biomedical model focuses on the mechanism and development purely of the somatic or the neurobiological systems. The biopsychosocial that extends it incorporates the red and the blue boxes, and the black cells then are the additional evolutionary what the evolutionary perspective incorporates. So again, just for illustrative purposes, looking at the psychological level and Tinbergen's 4 questions, one can ask, what are the psychological mechanisms related to mood and motivation? And in terms of development, what is the developmental history and influences on the system? And in terms of phylogeny, we can ask, what are the homologous systems affecting mood and motivation in closely related species? And also the final one is function. What is the function of the system? The systems related to mood and motivation. In other words, what is the function of sadness and low mood? A question that is never asked in mainstream psychiatry. So again, just to point out this visually, unless you believe that all the other questions are unimportant, that's to say the questions that are not in red, because that is the focus of current biological psychiatry, unless you believe that all the other questions in blue and black are unimportant, then you would agree with us that it is worthwhile considering the evolutionary perspective. So some of the benefits of the EvoBioPsychoSocial model is that it embeds the biopsychosocial model firmly within the life sciences and provides it with a solid scientific grounding. It demonstrates that all 3 biopsychosocial levels are in fact biological, as I mentioned. Combining Tinbergen's 4 causal domains with the biopsychosocial 3 levels provides the opportunity to uncover processes and levels of interactions that would otherwise remain hidden. It makes thinking about animal models, and I think this is an important point, which is quite commonly overlooked in mainstream psychiatry with non-evolutionary approaches. It makes thinking about animal models less arbitrary and more scientific by introducing the phylogenetic dimension. The EvoBioPsychoSocial model has the potential for producing future novel avenues for theorizing research on disease and disorder. It can have immediate clinical benefits by prompting clinicians into becoming less reductionistic and more attentive to multiple relevant contexts, facilitates medical education by organizing knowledge logically, and reduces stigma, or has the potential to reduce stigma by underlining the universality of the systems that can malfunction, leading to suffering and disorder. But a note of caution that the EvoBioPsychoSocial model is a work in progress and is currently at its early stages of development, but we would suggest that it holds a promise of important future insights and practical applications. So I'll leave you with some questions. So the first is the EvoBioPsychoSocial model relevant to clinicians? If so, how? If not, is there a better, simpler, more effective way of incorporating evolution into the biopsychosocial model? And can the EvoBioPsychoSocial model advance research and understanding of mental disorder? And if so, how. And if there is still anyone out there listening, I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Riadh. That was really fascinating, and I really enjoyed that overview. I think you took us through, there was a mixture of the history of medicine, psychiatric thought, philosophy, and dare I say it, at the risk of sounding like I'm trying to make a bad joke, moving from biomedical to biopsychosocial to EvoBioPsychoSocial, there is a sense that the ideas are evolving all along. Boom, boom. But you've really laid out the case very well, and you've actually raised the question that I was going to ask you myself already. But I'm just wondering if we could have maybe a more focused clinical approach to how we deal with this, and that would be, these ideas you discuss are very persuasive, very well thought out, very logical. But I wonder, how would they apply in an everyday clinic setting? So say, for example, treating someone with depression in an outpatient clinic, how might these ideas help a psychiatrist to help their patients at a practical level?
Yes, I mean, this is obviously the ultimate aim is, of course, for theory to have clinical and practical applications. There's no doubt about it. But what I would say on that is that the applications may be one or two steps removed from direct direct therapeutic benefits, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an immediate relevance in the clinical setting. I would start by saying that the mindset of the clinician can be influenced and by the evolutionary perspective, and that can have immediate benefits to patients, in the sense that an appreciation of the context of the patient's life, and the meaning of the low mood that they are experiencing within that context, that can have an immediate impact on the clinical interaction. So just simply having the mindset that we mustn't be thinking in simplistic terms that what the patient's problem is can simply be reduced to the actions of receptors and neurotransmitters, and what sometimes is glibly called chemical imbalance and such things, and this is really what the critics of the biomedical model has referred to as dehumanizing. And I think that the evolutionary perspective humanizes or contributes to the humanization of the patient's experience, while not losing sight of the processes that are happening at lower levels of organization. I mean, I think that the color code of that particular table is demonstrative of this, because the evolutionary approach does not neglect any of the aspects of all the levels. We recognize that that we have phenotypic end products such as the capacity for low mood, but we also recognize that neurotransmitters and receptors and so forth are still important, and still have a a role in our understanding of what is going on, but that's not the end of the story. So I'm hoping that one immediate benefit would be that we would stop saying that depression is a chemical imbalance. I mean, that in itself would be a step forward. So that's the first thing: is humanizing the interaction, the clinical interaction, and the mindset of the clinician, and also I would say, reducing stigma by the approach that these systems are universal. We are all vulnerable to varying degrees to respond by experiencing low mood and so forth under certain circumstances, that the patient's experience is not qualitatively or fundamentally different. I think these are all destigmatizing processes. And of course, then there is the issue of the benefits in terms of research questions, research questions that would be that would not be conceivable outside the evolutionary perspective. So again, looking at that 12-cell table, you will only the non-red table, the non-red cells will only be visible to you if you take a non-biomedical approach. If you stick to a strict biomedical approach, everything except the red cells will be invisible to you. And so the research questions will not arise. You will be stuck in the chemical imbalance framework, and that limits the scope of future, interventions and so forth in clinical practice that would be of benefit to patients. So I don't know whether I answered your questions, but I don't want to claim that we have, just simply by applying evolution, that we will have a immediate solution to the problems of mental health. It is the solutions will come downstream, but I think understanding what we're dealing with is a very important first step.
Yes. Thank you, Riadh. Yeah, I mean, I think as your slide demonstrated so clearly, the evolution perspective expands immeasurably our perspectives beyond biopsychosocial or biomedical models, and that leads then to infinite questions when it comes to research and clinical applications. So thank you for that. And we time just maybe for one or two other questions, if anyone would like to put a question to Riadh live here.
I think there is a question in the chat box.
There is. I think it really emphasizes what you've been saying. It's from Eniko. Do we need to emphasize the E in the BPS model, since evolutionary theories are very much part of the biological theory? So I think that really just emphasizes the whole thrust of what you've been getting at.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So yeah, so I think unless there's anyone else with questions, I think this is being recorded, so we'll bring it to an end, and it will be on our playlist and distributed widely through YouTube. And again, I would like to thank Riadh for attending again. This is your third engagement with us at an official level. You've been twice virtually, and you were in Portlaoise with us as well in person. So we really appreciate your ongoing support and your enthusiasm, and you've led the way in terms of evolutionary psychiatry in this part of the world, Riadh. So we're forever grateful to you.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to seeing the recording.
Thank you, Riadh.